I read the second book in the series first. This first book details how the apocalypse gets started and the origins of the second book's supporting cast. Here, they're the main focus. A nuclear war in the Mideast sets off, it isn't clear how, a complete power blackout in the United States. Once the power stops, the sharpest minds realize big cities will quickly exhaust their food supplies and become death traps. Roads gridlock as cars stall or run out of gas. Martin Weiss, a Manhattan rabbi, along with wife Miriam and their 2 daughters, heads out immediately with what camping and hiking gear they can carry. They head north to Tarrytown, home of Walt Thomas, a blue-collar guy, and brother to Martin's friend Jason, who now homesteads in Kentucky. The 2 families head there, first sailing south in Thomas's boat and walking west through the Carolinas and Appalachia. Jason's son Rune, a student at Georgia Tech, flees Atlanta with his Latin girlfriend. It's a 300-mile hike to Kentucky. Jason and his wife farm in a basic fashion like their Amish and Mennonite neighbors, using horses, burning wood for heat, and canning food. The religious folk, nearly untouched by the collapse of an outside modern world they shun, look to Jason to explain what's going on out there. The story launches a scenario more likely in the real world than, say, zombies. As cyber warfare becomes a reality, an attack on the power grid we depend upon for everything isn't hard to envision. Why is it done? Neither we nor the characters know. O'Neill speculates it's to take the U.S. out of the global equation, opening the way elsewhere to the military ambitions of China or perhaps another power. Unlike The Walking Dead, there's little violence. People die quickly of starvation and exposure as the nation's food supply and transportation web break down. Most don't have access to a pre-industrial farm with a large firewood supply, dairy cattle, horses, tools for horse-powered farming, and enough farming knowledge to make a go of producing enough food to get through the next winter. Jeffers soberly reflects the world's huge population is a recent thing, and this famine merely a reversion to the mean. There's this painful arithmetic. There are fewer people left to produce food, and without mechanized agriculture and fertilizers, they produce far less food per acre than required to support a large population. Until 1900 or so, the world's food never supported more than 1 billion people. Now there are 8 billion. It's possible survivors can't supply even enough food to feed themselves. Our characters know, struggling through the first winter, that their existence is precarious. A poor growing season, errors in planting or seeding, draft animals dying, tools that break that can't be fixed or replaced, or any number of other small calamities might cause starvation the following winter. Earlier humanity lived with this as well, but these folks are starting from scratch. Jeffers explores the 6 societies we're making after a disaster clears the slate. People must produce to support themselves, can't rely on help from the government or anyone else outside, can spare little charity for others, must produce something to trade with others, and band together in small voluntary communities bound by ties of blood, faith, or proximity. They farm individually, not collectively. They pair off to have children to support them when they're old. People must prepare to defend themselves, but the starvation sweeping the land leaves survivors more likely to face an eerie silence and the stench of dead bodies than hostile marauders. Jeffers' portrayal of the die-off is chilling. He also puts intellectual battles into his books, particularly that between politically correct gender thought and the new realities restoring to the fore reproduction and a new commonality between men and women. In the second book, the battle focuses on lesbian countercultural activists. Here in this first book, the tensions center on the Weisses. Martin Weiss first confronts the blue-collar guy, Walt Thomas, who has both more practical skills than Weiss and a more brutal approach to real-world necessity. Weiss must come to grips with this. The gentility and charity he believed in no longer suffice. Thomas is better adapted to this new world. Miriam Weiss is a women's studies professor, her shoulder chip on a hair trigger against perceived male slight. She's utterly distrustful of blue-collar goyim like Walt Thomas and rednecks like McCoy O'Neill, and now finds herself in small-town Kentucky where most have never met a Jew. She is forced to face the new reality. She and her family are dependent upon these people, and there's no Jewish community to go cluster with. In a long conversation with Martin, O'Neill spells out in excruciating detail the damage coastal elites have done to heartland places like Kentucky for decades. Its economy destroyed, its boys gone to war because it's the only job available, and addicted to opioids when they return. Its rural and small town population has grown obese, TV addicted, and welfare dependent, most no longer with the productive mechanical or agricultural skills that once made them the nation's backbone. They are no better able to survive than the Weiss's Manhattanite neighbors, despite being surrounded with arable land. O'Neill deconstructs the greater world in which they live, its economy, its energy dependence, its wars, its giant corporations, its fragile electronic financial web, the postmodern values that have destroyed family and community life. This reminded me as a big-picture monologue of John Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged, but don't worry, it's not that long and much more readable. Making this series with its philosophical underpinnings readable was a priority for Jeffers, and he succeeded brilliantly at that. Weiss and O'Neill ride on horseback through deserted Kentucky countryside, encountering bodies rotting on roads, in fields, and homes. The starvation is reminiscent of Stalin's starvation of the Ukrainian peasants, the Holodomor. The starvation is recent, but its seeds were planted long ago. Martin must confront what his world, with all the power, wrought upon this one, and is shattered by it. He sees the contempt he and his once had for those in flyover land, its survivors now his only hope for survival. Miriam gets her mind blown by some new necessities. O'Neill rescues some starving teenage girls, selecting them from other dying people. He can't help everyone, because he has young unmarried men working for him. They need young women, and the community needs to repopulate. Miriam goes ballistic. He just wants them as a harem for sick male lust. She must finally adapt to the new era, and to her credit, she does. Pregnant women will need midwives, and in becoming one, she becomes central to the group's survival. One thing I don't like about the two books is Jeffers' portrayal of police. He comes from a Quaker background, plus his objectivist philosophy, eschewing the initiation of violence, finds it implicit in law enforcement. Break the law and you go to jail or get shot as a form of extortion. Intellectually, I get it. But here, the cops seem little more than violent protectors of a corrupt order, with revenge repeatedly wreaked on them after society breaks down. Jeffers implies a certain justice to it. Walt Thomas viciously settles a score with a local cop before departing for Kentucky. Jeffers has drug dealers getting even for the war on drugs, and jihadis for Mideast wars by killing Jews. This is dangerously close to saying we deserved 9/11. Maybe Rosie O'Donnell and the staff of The Nation agree, but I sure don't. That government and laws have an underlying violence is true, and it's reasonable to examine. It should make us hesitant to pass new laws and aim to get along with as few as necessary. But it's not reasonable to paint police in such dark tones or condone retaliation against them. Jeffers did much research for the series and in fact lives a life a lot like that of Jason Thomas, homesteading in rural Kentucky in a small cluster of like-minded religious and secular folk. He researched Orthodox Jews in Manhattan, and for his second book, a gay activist rural commune, seeking to find what made each group tick. His detail on the farming life really makes the book. It's what he does every day, so he didn't have to research that. Jeffers sees the post-apocalypse as both forcing and creating the opportunity for a new social order on objectivist principles. No other way is possible with the disappearance of the government, taxes, money, mass communication, or a larger economy. It also would restore people to fundamental values of production, labor, enterprise, risk, and valuing those who succeed at that. And he sees a subtle redemption in people returning to traditional gender roles as it gets men and women working together rather than at each other's throats. Besides, needing to repopulate, the women will have more babies. They'll start younger, more of their lives will be taken up with child rearing, and if successful, then grandchild assisting. Domestic labor, meanwhile, becomes both more demanding, necessary, and absorbing. Canning 300 jars of tomato to get through next winter, while the men are raising a barn or plowing the North 40 with horses, leaves less time for fuming about gender roles and perhaps less cause for it.